Go ahead. Go up.
All right, we will be in Genesis chapter 28 this evening. Genesis chapter 28. And last week we looked at the first 9 verses of that chapter, sort of finishing up the conflict between Isaac and his family as they sort of went through the mess of trying to bless Esau and then ended up blessing Jacob instead. And so Jacob then was sent away. He was sent to go away from Esau, and then Esau married another woman. But pick up in verse 10 then. Genesis chapter 28 and verse 10. And we have Jacob leaving Beersheba. It says he went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. Haran is the name of Abraham's relative from all those chapters ago, and where Abraham's family still lives. And he's going there, of course, to flee Esau's wrath, and they will not see each other for another 20 years after this. And he's going secondary, I suppose, to find a wife that will please his parents, unlike the wives that Esau had chosen. And so he will go in to live with what is his uncle Laban. And it says in verse 11, it says, he came to a certain place, and he stayed there all night because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of that place and put it at the head, and he lay down in that place to sleep. And so he camped under the stars with a stone for a pillow, which doesn't sound just super comfortable, but he's making it work. And it's about 60 miles from Beersheba to the place that he is, that is called Luz, or later called Bethel. And so that's, if you're really pushing it, that's a couple of days travel that he's probably gone. On his way, it's about a month to get all the way back to Haran. So he's very early in his trip back to his mother's household, and he lays down and he spends the night there, and he has this dream. It says in verse 12, he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to heaven, and there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And so he has this dream, and he's going to come to realize at the end of the dream that it was some kind of vision or some kind of communication from God, which is interesting because later in chapter 39, remember, Joseph, his son, has dreams about stars and the sun and the moon bowing down to him, dreams about sheaves of wheat bowing down to him. And Jacob will rebuke him, it says. He rebukes him for the dreams that he has. But then it says that after he rebukes him, he kept the matter in mind. And you're kind of wondering if he remembers his own dream from God and is beginning to question, well, could Joseph then be having dreams from God just like I did? And in this dream, he sees a ladder, and the bottom of the ladder is on the earth, and the top of the ladder is touching up into heaven, and there are angels coming down the ladder and going back up the ladder. And in essence, what you're looking at is what the people of Babel themselves tried to do. Remember, they wanted to build some kind of tower, in essence, almost a ladder that would reach up to the heavens. But remember, they wanted to glorify themselves when they built that ladder. And so they said, let us make a name for ourselves. We'll build this tower that goes up into the sky. And so we know God scattered them. That's why they call it Babel. He made their languages like Babel to each other, and he scattered them all over the earth. But it's not because God doesn't want people to have access to heaven. And that's what we see here with this ladder. He's having this vision where there is this connection between heaven and between earth. And so he didn't scatter all the people to keep them from having access to God or having access to heaven. It's just that God wants to provide that access. God wants to be the one to give us that connection, and we do it for his glory and not for our own glory. And of course, angels is just a word that means messenger. And so you have these messengers, they're bringing a message down from God. is kind of what's pictured, and then returning back to God. Yes, ma'am.
I read something the other day, another thing, and it said angels sometimes is said as glory.
As glory. I've not heard that as far as like the translation goes. I've not heard that. Certainly that you can see in some scripture that they have an element of glory about them. They shine like Moses' face does, or and so that they dwell in glory. I think there are scriptures that talk about them dwelling in glory.
Maybe I could have read it wrong.
But I don't know of any scriptures where the word angel is translated glory, but that's there's certainly an element of glory about them. Yes, ma'am. So these angels, because they dwell in God's presence, and they are bringing messages to earth and then returning back to God. Now the latter is one of the neatest kind of pictures in the scripture that the New Testament will talk about, but we'll look at that in just a minute. And so God then speaks to Abraham to Jacob in this dream. And he says in verse 13, he says, "Behold, the Lord stood above it." God is not coming up and down the ladder himself. He just stands next to the ladder and he says, "I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac." And so, in other words, your family knows me. Right? I'm the God that your family has been dealing with ever since you came to this land. And he says, the land on which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants. And so, in other words, I have chosen you to carry on the promises that I gave to Abraham. Now, it's kind of interesting because there's no record of God appearing to Isaac until after Abraham's death. And that's sort of the idea of who is it that God communicates with in this time period? The patriarch, right? This is the patriarchal era. He deals with the head of the household. And so he talks to Abraham. Once Abraham dies, then that's when we see that he speaks directly to Isaac and he says, "Now you will carry this on." And so he's come to Jacob, but Isaac is not dead yet. Why does he appear to Jacob now, even though Isaac is still the patriarch of the family? And it's kind of hinted at here in verse 13. Remember where Jacob is going: out of the promised land, back to Rebekah's family.
This is before he left the promised land.
He's still in the promised land, that's right.
What was your question?
Why does God appear to Jacob before Isaac has died, before the patriarch is dead? And he says in verse 13, "The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants." And so, as Johnny says, he's still in the promised land, but he is on his way out. And so there is this concern: what if he doesn't come back? What if he gets settled there? What if he begins worshiping the gods who were there? What if, and so God has appeared to him as he is leaving the promised land. Because remember, Abraham would not let that happen. He would not let Isaac leave the promised land, but Jacob is leaving. And so he starts to give him the promises. In verse 13, here is the land promise. Abraham was given 3 promises in Genesis chapter 12. You will have a great land, your descendants will be numerous, and you will bless every family on earth. And you find all 3 of them here repeated. In verse 13, the land will belong to your descendants. Verse 14, your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and the east and the north and the south. And in it, the 3rd promise, and in your seed, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And so Isaac hasn't died yet, but God can see he's got to get to Jacob before Jacob leaves the promised land. And so he gives him all of these promises, just like he gave them to Abraham, and then later on to Isaac. Now, it's kind of interesting because
this is God's way of making sure he comes back to the promised land.
That's just it, yeah. And the further down we go, the more that we're going to see that evident. But that's just it. He's maybe wouldn't have done this at this point if Jacob wasn't leaving the promised land. And so he talks here. He says, in your seed, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now we know when that came to fulfillment. When were all the families of the earth blessed by Abraham's seed? Through Christ, that's right. And so Christ is the ultimate fulfillment of this. But in this particular instance, that is especially in mind because of what Jesus says in John chapter 2. You'll turn with me to John chapter 2. And in John chapter 2 and verse 51, this is very early in Jesus' ministry in the book of John. I'm sorry, it's John chapter 1, actually. It's the last verse of John chapter 1. John chapter 1 and verse 51. Very early in Jesus' ministry, he has been baptized by John, and John has begun pointing him out. He's the Messiah, he's the Christ, he's the one that I saw the dove, descending down upon him at his baptism. And some of John's disciples have begun to ask him questions, and they bring Nathanael. And Nathanael's a little bit skeptical at first, what good could come out of Nazareth, he says. But then he goes and he sees Jesus for himself, and he asks Jesus questions. And so he says in verse 49, he says, "You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And Jesus says, "Just because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And then verse 51, he says, "Assuredly I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." And so at this point, that should sound very familiar, because it's the exact same language that's being used when Jacob is dreaming, and he says there's this ladder, and the angels of God are ascending and descending upon the ladder. And so Christ is making a correlation there. Who is Christ in Jacob's dream? Or where do you see Christ in Jacob's dream? He's the ladder. That's right. Christ is our connection from earth to heaven. The only way that you will ever go from earth to heaven is if you are on the ladder, if you are connected to Christ as that ladder. And so, talking about angels, right? It just means messenger. That's what his message does for us. If you want to know how to climb the ladder to heaven, you listen to his message that he brought down to us. And his message is the one that gets us to heaven. That's the point of Hebrews chapter 1 and verses 1 through 2. Hebrews chapter 1, when he says, in times past, God spoke to the fathers in various ways. But now, who is the only one he speaks through? He speaks through his Son. And that's the apostles gave his Son's words to us in the form of the New Testament. And that's even John chapter 12 and verse 47. John chapter 12 and verse 47. Jesus says, if anyone hears my words and does not believe, he says, I do not judge him. I came to save the world. That's what Jesus' message is all about. He came to deliver a message of salvation, and that if we would hear that message, we can climb that ladder. We can be on that ladder up to heaven. That's what his message does for us. But verse 48, he says, he who rejects me and does not receive my words has that which judges him. The word that I have spoken will judge him in the last day. And so anyone who rejects the message rejects the ladder. And they do not have access to heaven. They do not have access to all that Christ offers them if they've not heard that message, if they've rejected that message that Christ delivered. And so what Jacob is experiencing, I don't know if he ever even knew that was a symbol of the Christ to come. But with the New Testament, we can see that even in this moment that Jacob is dreaming, God is thinking about you and me. He is thinking about the future and the Christ who would come to offer us all salvation. And so with that in mind, when we go back to Genesis chapter 28, as we read the message that God has for Jacob, recognize that in its own way, it is a message that's also for you and me, especially what he says in verse 15. Genesis 28 and verse 15, he says, behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. And so the big idea picture of that verse is, trust me, I will take care of you. That's what he's telling Jacob. He says, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. Now remember, how did people of this time think about the gods as far as location goes? They kind of had the idea that gods were stuck. Their authority or their power was only good in one location. And you know that story in the Bible where it talks about, these two people come against each other and they fight, and one of them loses, and they say, well, we fought them in the hills, so their God must be a God of the hills. So if we go down to the valleys, we're sure to win because their God doesn't have any power in the valleys. And then they went down in the valleys and they found that God can win anywhere. It doesn't really matter. He's not a God that's bound by location. That's what God is trying to tell Jacob here. He's saying, anywhere that you go. Jacob's probably thinking, the God of Isaac is the God of this land. And I'm going off to a different land, and so I'll need a new God when I get there. And God is reminding him, anywhere you go, I am not bound by location. And then he continues and he says, I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. And so he's saying, don't reject the promises that I gave to Abraham because I am reliable. And that's when Jesus tells us today, if we are faithful, he will bring us back home to be with God. When he tells us that anywhere that we go, it says, in Matthew chapter 28, he says, lo, I am with you until the end of the ages. Anywhere we go, no matter how long it takes, Jesus is not bound by time. He is not bound by location. He's not bound by our difficulties. He can get us through anything if, like he's telling Jacob here, we just trust him. He can get us back to our heavenly home. And so, any thoughts or comments on what we've looked at so far?
Do we have any verses that shows us that Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob had told their families about the promises that God had made to them? I know that sometimes they taught them like they were supposed to be taught, but sometimes they didn't. So I don't know.
In the book of Acts, when it tells Abraham's story, it reveals that, sometimes when you read Genesis chapter 12, when it says God called Abraham and Abraham went, you kind of get the feeling that it was like, maybe Abraham had a dream or something one night and he heard from God, and the next morning he packed up and went. But in the book of Acts, I think it's Stephen reveals that he doesn't actually leave right away. In fact, there's maybe even several years in there where Abraham has heard the call of God, but he has not left for the promised land yet. And so, they were with their family some, so there is that possibility, but I don't know of any scriptures that tells us in particular that, Abraham was evangelical with his family. I'm not even sure that would have been a thought that they would have had at this point, and certainly we don't see any indication that God has asked Abraham to do that yet. And so, yeah.
Well, and Elijah, when he was going to be in the fire chariot, and it seemed like everybody knew about it.
Right.
And all the prophets, everywhere he went, he's going to be going, and I thought, well, I do think, even the people in the land, lots of times, know all the things that's happened in Egypt.
Sure.
The word travels somehow, some way back then.
That's true.
And I really feel like that, the promises that were given to Abraham, I'm sure Sarah knew the promises.
Sure.
And I'm sure the family knew the promises.
Could be.
This is something we're looking forward to.
Right.
Because the God of the heavens and the world is doing things for us. I just think it doesn't have to be even said.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, could be. Yeah.
Well, and circumcision, you think about things like circumcision and things that were part of the covenant. How do you see conversation about God's law and what the expectation was?
Yes. Certainly within Abraham's own family, as far as, his wife and children and all of those people, once they came to the promised land, it seems very evident that they all knew those things. Yeah. As far as the family back home, Moses tells us that they were still idol worshipers. And that's in Joshua 2. He says, you can choose the gods of Egypt. You can choose the gods of the people of this land. You can choose the gods of your fathers on the other side of the river, which is the Euphrates, where he's going now. That Moses and Joshua tell us that Abraham's ancestors and the descendants that came from them, they are idol worshipers. But that doesn't mean that they didn't hear about this from Abraham. The Bible just doesn't tell us exclusively that they did.
God tell Abraham to teach
See, yes, right before Sodom and Gomorrah, he says, you're going to be a great nation. And so you need to know how to teach your descendants But that doesn't necessarily go backwards to his father or his father's household. Yeah.
I just had a thought that if we could do away with all this modern technology, we think that word gets out faster because of what's on TV or the computer or the phone or something like that. But whenever you are completely devoid of any type of technology like that, things get out through by word of mouth real quick, because people will listen. When you say listen up, I have something to tell you. They listen.
Yeah.
So, they were hungry for something
Sure.
to hear, and so I think word got out quicker by word of mouth that way than it does even by telephone or
Maybe
computer or TV.
within a community that might be true. Yeah. So, okay.
It travels pretty fast across the world too, because people are moving all the time.
Yeah. But of course, if you don't have cars and trains, then
Right.
it's going to take a few months to get from place to place. But yeah.
But it still gets around pretty quick.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, he continues then, and Jacob is very moved by this experience. And so he starts out in verse 16, and it says that Jacob awoke from his sleep, and he said, "Surely that the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And so, he's moved to believe this dream. And that's, sometimes, well, I do this, I wake up from a weird dream and I think, well, that was weird, I'm glad that dream is over, or whatever. But that's his response is, this is a message from God, which was really a common response during his day. You can read about it in all kinds of literature. But he believes that God has communicated with him in some way, and it's very similar to sort of the idea back from chapter 15 and verse 6 when God speaks to Abraham, and it says Abraham believes him, and it was accounted to Abraham as righteousness, that he believes the message. And then he says in verse 17, it says he was afraid, and he said, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." And so he was moved to believe the dream, but he was also moved to feel fear because he felt that he was in God's presence. And that's a very common theme throughout this time period is to be in God's presence was something that the people were afraid of. And, remember, it's in the book of Judges chapter 13 and verse 22, when the angel of the Lord appears to Samson's parents, right? And he seeks out Samson's parents and he speaks to them. But after he's gone, once Samson's father realizes what happens, he says in verse 22, he says, "We shall surely die because we have seen God." And that was just the common feeling. And that's when she kind of comes back and she says, he wouldn't tell us all that stuff. He was going to kill us, right? Like, use your brain. But that was just the common automatic response. And that's why when you have angels appearing, what do they always say first? Be not afraid. Because to experience something like that was terrifying to people. And they had this linked idea of to see God is to die. And so it says he was afraid, and he said, "How awesome is this place," right? This is a more significant spot than just a place to sleep in. I didn't realize what it was. And so he links God to the location, to the promised land, which I think is what God wants him to do, because that's right there at the end of verse 15, right? He says, "I will bring you back to this land." This is God's purpose in speaking to Jacob right now. He's convincing Jacob to come back home when it's all said and done. And so Jacob is impressed by this place now. This is a place that, if you experience it there, he's going to want to return to this place. And that's exactly what he does later on. If you look in chapter 35, and it starts in verse 1, but God said to Jacob, he said, "Arise, go up to Bethel," and that's what Jacob is fixing to name this location. He says, "Go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau, your brother." And so eventually he does make his way back there. And you think if you experience something like that and you were leaving, you would want to come back to there. And so he's impressed by the place. He says, "This is none other than the house of God. It is the gate of heaven." Right? And so his point is, this is where God dwells. This this is his home. This is where heaven touches earth, is what he's saying. And as we noted, in a sense, that really is true. This is the promised land where ultimately Jesus would be born. And what does it say about Jesus in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 23? It says to call him Emmanuel, God with us. That's the promised land would really be the place where God's presence was. That's in Jerusalem later on, but especially in the form of Jesus, where in a sense heaven touches earth, because God would take the form of man and be on this earth with them. And so he continues then, and I don't know if he goes back to sleep, but he doesn't get up until morning. And it says in verse 18, it says, Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put at his head, and he set it up as a pillar, and he poured oil on top of it. And so to pour oil on something is, as we talked about on Sunday night, to consecrate something or to make it special, to anoint it for a particular purpose, can't be used in any other way after this. And so he's not exactly setting up an altar, because you have to build an altar. An altar is, something of a little bit of construction, but he's sort of making the next best thing, sort of a makeshift altar almost, and pouring oil on it. He's making it a memorial. You might think about in the book of Joshua when it talks about they would gather stones and make memorial stones out of them. And Joshua would say, when you see these stones and your children ask you, well, what do those stones mean? And he would say, well, tell the story about how we crossed through the Jordan River, or tell the story about how we did this or that. He's sort of making this place that he can come back to, and he can find this stone. And it's something for him to remember, something for him to hold on to. And so it says he took the stone and he set it up as a pillar, and he poured oil on top of it, and he called the name of that place Bethel. And so that's Beth is the Hebrew word for house. El is a shortened version of the Hebrew word for God. And so he calls it the house of God, is what he's named it, which is what he said back in verse 17. This is none other than the house of God. And he says, but the name of that city had been Luz previously. And so that's just what the Canaanites called it. Now this doesn't mean that the Canaanites started calling it Bethel. They probably didn't even know that he did all these things, But the Israelites certainly would begin to call it Bethel later on. That's why Moses refers to it here this way. And so, but also to rename the location, who has the right to name something? Like, who has the right to name children? Yeah, the parents of the children, the ones in authority. And so you kind of see his faith here. He is recognizing himself as the future owner of this spot. He's saying, I have the authority to decide what to call this place. And though he will not own it himself, and his descendants would, he's recognizing that as the father of those descendants, he has the right to name it. And so you kind of see his faith coming through here. And that's Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 9. Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 9, it talks about Abraham and his family. And it says, starting in verse 9, it says, by faith Abraham dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob. And they all did live together for a short time. The heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. In other words, they knew the promised land belonged to them, but they never owned any of it except for that cave that Abraham bought to bury Sarah and the descendants in. And so it continues, and he says there in verse 10, he says that they were willing to live in that land, but never receive it for themselves, because they recognized God had a greater city, a spiritual city that they would be a part of someday, a city that he himself would build. And so it picks up in verse 13 of Hebrews 11, and it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises. That is, they understood God would not fulfill the promise in their lifetime, but having seen them afar off, they were assured of them, they embraced them, they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out of, right? So this is what Jacob is doing. He's going back to the country that they had come out of. He says if they had thought about it, they would have had opportunity to return. Jacob does return back to that homeland where his family lives in houses, where his family actually owns the land that they are living on, where there's probably much more sense of community and comfort than what they have in the promised land. But in verse 15, he says they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Even then, Abraham and Isaac and eventually Jacob are going to come to recognize that owning the promised land is not as great as being a part of the heavenly realm that God had created for them. And so therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared that city for them. And if he's prepared it for them, he has prepared it for us too. And so it's similar to what Peter says when he says to think of ourselves as pilgrims and sojourners on the earth. Even if we live in brick houses or whatever it is, even if we have a city that we do live in, that's not truly home. Because home is that eternal city that we want to live in. And so if we think of ourselves as pilgrims and sojourners on this earth like Jacob did, then we'll be more willing to give up whatever it takes to be right with God and to be in that eternal city. And so we're beginning to see that faith forming in Jacob in Genesis chapter 28. Now, in verse 20, any thoughts or comments on that before we move on? Okay. In verse 20, it says, then Jacob made a vow. Right? We're beginning to see him really commit. He's beginning to commit to God. It says he made a vow. That's something that's binding. It can't be broken. He says, if God will be with me. And notice that he's not completely committing to God yet. There's the if God will be with me. And that's, Abraham, by the time that he died, he knew God well. And Isaac has grown to know God well. Of course, Jacob was not even born when Abraham took Isaac up on the mountain to sacrifice him. And all of those events took place. Isaac experienced that. Abraham experienced that. Jacob has not had as many experiences with God yet. And so God is proving himself to Jacob. And so he says, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I'm going and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on. And so that's what God promised. I will take care of you wherever you go. And so he's saying, if he will provide for me, and especially he's saying outside of this area, he says in verse 20, in this way that I am going, if you really are a God who can extend beyond the reaches of the promised land into a different God's realm. Yes, sir.
I was just thinking, do we know that word was translated correctly?
Which one? If, yeah.
We could say since, and then it would mean totally different.
It could. In the New Testament, that's very true. Sometimes the Greek word for if could be translated since and make the same thing.
Yeah, if you plug the word since God will be with me, it changes that thought.
Yes, it does. Hebrew has more words than Greek does, and they tend to have more defined kind of meaning. And so, but and you could read it that way and kind of see it as his commitment. Since he will be with me, I will come back and do this. But you do see Jacob's doubts going forward as well. So yeah.
Also, at the end of that thought where he says if,
Mm-hmm.
then he says, then the Lord shall be my God.
And that's
kind of,
even right here,
he meant if.
we kind of see a little bit of that doubt. Yeah, because
Also the part where it said, so that I may come back, and that instead it would probably be
when. Yeah. So even you're right about that. Even the wording here kind of shows us that he's taking God up on it when he sees all the evidence, and so that's a good point. It's not when I come back, it's if he's able to bring me back. It's and as he said, then the Lord shall be my God, right? He hasn't fully committed to him being his God yet. And so he says, if he will provide for me outside of this area, then I will return and I will commit to him. And so he says, verse 21, so they come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And then he makes his part of the vow, and that's A vow almost always has two parts. Here is God's part. Take care of me while I'm gone. Bring me back here in peace. Jacob's part is verse 22. And this stone, which I have set as a pillar, right, his pillow from last night, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. And so sometimes when we see the word God's house, we think about like the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle, or even the temple. Of course, he's not talking about that. This is Bethel. The temple is going to be built in Jerusalem, and so he's not thinking about that far. Probably what he's thinking about here is he's going to build an actual altar, which is what he does once we get to chapter 35 and verse 7. Once he returns to Bethel, in chapter 35 and verse 7, it says, he built an altar there, and he called the place El Bethel, because there God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. And you have a comment right here?
The tabernacle.
It was placed there.
Sit at Bethel for
It does.
a long time.
Yeah.
So earlier, whenever you're talking about being like the gateway to heaven,
Mm-hmm.
I started like looking at where we read about Bethel, and it's the home of the tabernacle for a really long time before David's able to move
Mm-hmm.
Ark to Jerusalem. But it's also where the Samaritans put the high places.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, well, that didn't really hold up very long.
No, yeah. Not the ultimate home of God. That's not what Jacob is talking about here. Although she is right. Bethel, in the end, it would belong to one of the tribes of Joseph. And so that, you think that was Jacob's favorite son. And they ended up being the owners of this location that was so important to Jacob individually. And you can read about that in Joshua 16. And then, as Sarah said, it was also the Ark of the Covenant was housed in Bethel, at least at the beginning of the time of Judges. And it kind of moves around some, but in the early days, and this is Judges chapter 20, verses 26 to 28, it talks about the high priest Phinehas, that's Aaron's grandson. He was there in Bethel, and that's where the Ark of the Covenant that Moses had built, that's where it was housed. And so in that sense, it was the house of God then. But what Jacob is really talking about is his own, what he was going to do there. He was going to build an altar, and that's why he says, the pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. Now, we tend to think about that as money. Money, I mean, they had coins, but it was not so significant to them, and they didn't trade money very much. Most likely, what a shepherd, which is what Jacob was, gives back to God is sheep, goats, rams, in the form of sacrifice, which is what you would build an altar for. And so he's saying, I'm going to come back here. I'm going to build an altar, and 1/10 of all of the blessings that you give me, I will sacrifice right here on this altar in this location where we had this real first encounter. Yes, sir.
I was just thinking, when they were giving that sacrifice, you give your very best.
That's right.
If you're a livestock person, you're giving your very best. You're giving your very best if you're breathing stock.
That's right.
That's a pretty good thing.
Mm-hmm. It really
More
is.
than just 10%.
That's right. It's
Of course, God's going to take care of you anyway. But
that's really the point, isn't it? Is you trust God so much that you take the rams or what have you that really would be the best ones to breed, and they can't be used, right? They're consecrated. They can't be used for anything else. You can't breed them and then sacrifice them, or that's all they can be, just a sacrifice, set in a pen and kept healthy just for that. And so you're really giving up all of that because you trust that God is going to take the 90% that you didn't sacrifice and work all that out even better, which is interestingly what we'll see. Jacob understood this to a degree, at least, because whenever he's having his dealings with Laban, he takes the worst of the livestock, right? They have spots, they have blemishes, and he says, I will take those. You can see that he trusts God's going to work all of that out, even taking the worst of them. And so leaving what should be the best for Laban, but it doesn't work out that way for Laban. And so, he's going to build this altar here. Now, this is what the righteous people did. Abraham did this. in well, I can't. In Genesis chapter 12, of course, Genesis chapter 12, as soon as he appeared in the land, it says that there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he does this multiple times throughout his time there. He builds an altar. Isaac does it after God appears to him for the first time, after Abraham's death. He has all those troubles with those wells. But when he finally has peace, it says and God appeared to him and gave him the promises. He built that altar to the Lord. That's where he sacrificed to God. Jacob knows those things. And so that's what he's promising to do. And then to give of the tithe, to give of the tenth, that was the common understanding of the people. And so that's what Abraham did in Genesis chapter 14. Remember when he went and he saved Lot from the kings of the north when they took all of Sodom, and he takes all of those goods that he rescued, and he went to Melchizedek, the king of Salem, which Bethel is really not very far, just a few miles north of Jerusalem, and so very close to where Melchizedek was. He went there and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." This is why you tithed, or why you gave a tenth, because you recognized ultimately it all came from God. He says, God gave you this success, and so it says he gave him a tithe of all. He gave him a tenth of all of that. God gave you that success, and so you give some back. That's what Jacob is saying. He says, if God really blesses me how he says he will, then of course I'll give at least a tenth of the very best back to him. And so yeah, any other thoughts or comments on what we've looked at here? We have access then to the true ladder, the ladder that is Jesus Christ himself. And he does encourage us to believe him and to be moved by the message that he gives us, and to commit ourselves each day to giving back to him and to following him. And so I think that's what this chapter really encourages us. If Jacob could do it to the ladder in his dream, we certainly should be able to do it with the true ladder and all of the information that he has given us. And so we will wrap up there tonight, and I'll let Johnny